comes from. This PSA will hopefully enlighten people. Since Europeans arrived in Canada, they have made efforts to eliminate and assimilate Indigenous peoples. Residential schools were a part of this colonial effort. Over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children went to the residential schools between their founding in the 1870s and the closure of the last one in 1996. The purpose of the schools was to destroy Indigenous culture and turn Indigenous children into good Christian Canadian citizens. In their review of 61 studies on the health impact of residential schools, Peter Wilk, Alana Maltby, and Martin Cook found that 43 of the studies found connections between negative mental health outcomes and residential schools. Mental health issues such as mental distress, depression, addictive behaviors, and substance misuse, stress, and suicidal behaviors have all been connected to residential schools. Many Indigenous children were sexually and physically abused in the schools, and as a result, they carried the trauma of that abuse with them, which ultimately led to the 60 Scoop.
The 60 Scoop, the government's legalized trafficking of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit children across the country, the US, and around the world, took place from the late 1950s to the 1980s, adopting children into non-Indigenous homes on a permanent basis. Without warning, child welfare workers came en masse to remove babies and children to reprogram the histories and identities of Indians unworthy of trusting and raising their children and saving them from themselves. The segregation and exclusion was not a specific welfare or child program or policy, but a failed social experiment of assimilation that was a replacement of traditionalized socialization with institutional abuse and trauma that lasted over several generations. The 60 Scoop was the tip of the iceberg, what is now the Institution of Aboriginal Child Welfare, and these children are still in care in disproportionate numbers. Children were apprehended by the thousands in questionable circumstances, with economic incentive rather than neglect or abuse emerging as the motive for removing these children from their homes.
The trauma from residential schools and 60 Scoop built on trauma from earlier forms of injustice and continues to be built on by modern forms. Trauma is cumulative. The oppression and abuse becomes internalized. Trauma can develop personality traits and methods of interacting with family, such as the need to control others, blaming others or self if things don't go as planned, denying feelings like loneliness and grief, denying or dismissing disrespectful and abusive behavior. These behaviors make a very toxic emotional atmosphere and prevent people from accepting themselves. People experiencing this behavior are more likely to develop helplessness, anxiety, depression, traumatic bonding, high-risk behaviors, emotional numbness, desire to self-medicate, loss of trust and faith, psychological defenses, emotional constriction, hypervigilance, inability to accept support, and many more. When children and babies aren't given a nurturing environment, their brain chemistry can change, which can cause many problems in life. This is compounded even further when they are exposed to abuse. These physiological changes in the brain can alter their genes, and that can be passed on to the next generation. Neurochemicals impact the development of a healthy fetus and strain parent-child relationships. These impacts make it more likely for the child to have behavioral challenges, less ability to cope with stress and addiction when they grow older. When they mature and have kids, this can transmit trauma, addiction, and anxiety to the next generation.